Hello, today we're going to be talking about societal responses to pollution. And I want to preface this discussion by saying that the societies that have been most successful in protecting the environment and protecting public health have been affluent democracies and have tended to be capitalistic also. I I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I want to comment that when communism existed in the Soviet Union and in the former Eastern Europe, you saw some horrific examples of pollution there. There was absolutely no incentive for uh, people who manage factories to control pollution. They were given simply an incentive to meet a quota. If their job was to produce 10,000 cars a year as the factory manager, that's all they cared about. Its impact on the environment, that was inconsequential. Because these were totalitarian regimes too, people's ability to protest was very limited. The ability of people to organize at the grassroots and demand change, having a more open society has been critical for developing appropriate protective measures. So today we're mostly going to be talking about about democracies that practice and do practice some form of capitalism. I want to start out though by going back in time. We've had pollution for quite some time. We've lived with it. Before the industrial period, it was mostly animal and human waste. This was the greatest threat of this type of waste was the spread of pathogenic microorganisms and macro parasites. Prior to the 1860s, people didn't have germ theory. So people, though, were able to deduce that certain climates, especially in the summer, were more healthy than others. And what you saw was that the rich, the powerful, the well-born, born with titles, were able to escape cities during the summer and go upriver, often into higher elevations. And they didn't know why, but at least they intuited that these were better for their health. These were places that would protect them. To some degree, their deduction was based on the false belief in Galen's miasma theory. Galen is a famous doctor from the Roman period. His idea that disease was caused by miasmas was believed in Great Britain really until, and a lot of the world, at least the European world, until the mid-19th century. A miasma is simply a bad odor. And it's astonishing to think that the British scientific establishment held to this theory really until 1854. But in some ways, the wealthy got lucky by adhering to this theory because the basic point was you escape these dark, these dank areas that smell bad, generally where the poor would live, poorly drained areas, and you go to places where you have lots of space and the air is clean. So in some ways, this false theory, though, helped them to deduce appropriately that, especially in the summer, it was better to get out of town. Now, we solved the problems of early industrial pollution through science. First of all, John Snow is responsible for showing us that microorganisms that can travel, for example, in water, can cause disease. For almost 20 years, he was arguing that cholera was caused by something that was carried in water. And because that went contrary to the scientific establishment, because he was from a poor family, he was rejected. And it wasn't until he carried out a very elegant experiment that his ideas won widespread acclaim. And what he was able to do was in London during the 19th century, at least the first half of the 19th century, people got their water from privatized sources, so that people living on one side of the street might get their water from one water provider, and people who lived on the other side of the street could get their water from another water provider. So what Snow did, and he's called the father of epidemiology, he went around mapping where cholera cases were and linking them to where individual got his or her water. And what he was able to do was show that people who got their water from downriver of the Thames, where all the wastewater would first empty into the Thames River, these were the people getting cholera. And he was able to convince people to remove a pump handle in a poor district where a lot of people were getting cholera. And as soon as the pump handle that was connecting people with a contaminated source of water was removed, cholera went away. So this represents the end of the miasma theory, but even John Snow didn't know exactly what was in the water that was causing disease. We have, over the next few decades, the development of germ theory, and three people play a critical role in that: Louis Pasteur, Joseph Lister, and Robert Koch. Koch's four postulates are especially important in establishing germ theory. And Lister, I'll give a shout out to. He's really important because he begins to put these ideas into practice. And the first place we see these ideas being put into practice are operating rooms in hospitals. Later, these ideas start to come into place in terms of sanitation infrastructure, piping in clean water for citizens, creating publicly run utilities, and also then taking that water that is created, the wastewater, sewage, and treating it appropriately before putting it back into the environment. And this has been a long process over time. Standards have gotten tougher and tougher in terms of what a wastewater treatment plant can put back into the environment. We're going to talk about demography later on in the semester, but if you have any thoughts at all about whether this is important or not, check out the role that public health, especially giving people better water, how that has affected death rates and life expectancy. All right, I want to switch from pre-industrial waste to early industrial pollution. And when we talk about early industrial pollution, we're talking about pollution in the pre-World War II, pre-1945 era. And we're going to discuss that separately from what comes after, in part because even though both could kill you, both could make you sick, there's still categorically something very different, and the response had to be different to the kinds of pollutants that were created after World War II. So first of all, if you think about the early industrial period, you have the rapid growth of cities. As industry is concentrated in the cities, and industry requires lots of workers at the time. Didn't have a lot of automation, of course, so lots of labor was required. And you had huge influx of people coming into these cities, living under poor conditions, often without even access to a basic latrine, and just defecating in the street. Early industrial period, it was not uncommon for a third of the population to not have access even to a basic latrine. Early industrial cities like Manchester were essentially disease incubators. In Manchester in 1840, 60% of working class children died before the age of 5, mostly due to a series of health insults, everything from very polluted air, poor nutrition, and many disease agents circulating in their environment. We talk about early industrial production and the types of pollution that came from it. We're talking about things like iron and steel and metals, some chemicals, mostly non-synthetic chemicals, that tended to rapidly degrade in the environment. Mining and textile dyes were major sources of pollution. The tanning industry, leather was really important, the belts that powered industry. That was very harsh on water. The chemicals that were used to treat leather. Um, and I don't want to minimize how bad the pollution was. If you've ever studied biology, you've probably heard of the pepper moth and natural selection. The pollution became so bad in central England and northern England that the lichens, which require clean air, which live on trees, died off. And this one particular species of moth, the dominant morph before, used to be a light colored variation that could camouflage on the lichens. And when the lichens disappeared, it flipped. So the dark colored variation that could better camouflage and escape bird predation by just sitting on the tree trunk, by hanging out on the tree trunk, became more common. So that's just a small indicator of how bad the pollution was. But even though it was really bad and it could harm humans and nature, pollution was localized and usually short-lived in the environment. So in terms of scale, what people were doing in Manchester, England, was having no impact on the Amazon or the people living in the Amazon, or on the Arctic and the people living in the Arctic. In part because it was short-lived, it didn't have the ability to move across the globe. Now, in terms of how society dealt with this pollution, economic considerations largely governed the actions of society undergoing industrialization. So as long as it was good for the economy, the idea was to keep moving forward, and such things as controlling pollution were not considered an appropriate response. And also comment on this period in that there were no pollution abatement technologies either. So the choices were to either continue doing what you were doing or just shut down factories. And that was the idea of shutting down factories was considered an intolerable option. I want to introduce a term now called negative externalities. Negative externalities occur when a third party is impacted by buyers and sellers. So if you think about how people define economic transactions, they tend to involve simply a buyer and a seller. A buyer comes into the marketplace looking to buy something. Seller makes an offer at a certain price. The buyer can either accept that offer or refuse it. What this definition does not account for is that sometimes third parties are unwittingly dragged into the transaction. When cost of production involves a lot of pollution, and that pollution is harming neighbors, it's harming people who extract resources from the environment, damaging neighboring farms, those people's interests are not being taken into account in the transaction. The seller and the buyer are able to do a better deal. The seller is able to perhaps sell at a lower cost, definitely sell at a lower cost than if they had to abate that pollution, and the buyer is also getting a better deal. Third parties impacted by this pollution are not getting a better deal. And what's important to note is there are still people in our society who dismiss the entire presence of negative externalities, who maintain the definition of an economic transaction as simply being between the two parties, the buyer and the seller. This is an important roadblock we have to still remove, especially in the United States, if we're going to deal more sensibly with environmental issues. So negative externalities are ignored for most of the period. Many industrialized or industrializing countries at the time took a laissez-faire approach and hence were in denial about third-party impacts. When pollution threatened the livelihoods of resource users, example, fishermen, oyster harvesters, judges tended to side with the party that produced the greatest economic value, which was usually the factory or power plant. All right, I want to explore how we can deal with environmental issues. And at least in people living in countries that are governed by constitutions, where there are democracies that ensure those constitutions are adhered to, um, you have three layers of law. The first is, of course, always the Constitution. And most countries have written constitutions. Great Britain has an unwritten constitution. A written constitution leaves a lot less room for ambiguity. The next level is what's called statutory law. These are laws made by legislative bodies, but they must be consistent with the powers that are granted to that legislative body by the Constitution. And finally, there's a third layer of law, and these are hierarchical, so this is the lowest layer. It's past judicial precedent. That's referred to as stare decisis. And that implies simply that because courts rule so in the past, that's the way we should continue to rule in the future. Of course, you can overturn past precedent with a new law, a change to the Constitution, or simply judges, which not supposed to happen often, but it can decide to ignore past precedent. All right, I want to bring up the law of nuisance. In the 19th and early part of the 20th century, the law of nuisance was the main way in which people dealt with environmental pollution. And the law of nuisance is part of common law that gets back at precedent and stare decisis. And it in part rests on the idea that people have a property rights to use their property how they desire to, and that depriving people of part of the use of their property constitutes a nuisance, and you can take that up in the courts. So how could nuisance law be used to protect the environment? An example, let's say you have an environment that's agricultural and somebody comes and opens up a copper smelting factory. That copper smelting factory is belching out a lot of toxic pollution. Of course, in the 19th century, people didn't understand how that could affect health, but they see the results. Farms around the copper smelting factory these are, let's say, dairy farms, start to suffer a dramatic decrease in milk production. Cows are dying, and now these farmers can go to court and sue, say that the copper smelting factory has deprived them of their property. And the judge would look at this, and cause and effect is very difficult to prove. So even with the best records, it might be hard to prove your case. But let's say if you did, the judge at best would probably tell this factory to pay you some money. It would not shut the factory down. And this is a very blunt tool. It sometimes would result in success, but it was rare. First of all, I mentioned it's hard to prove. It's difficult and expensive to litigate. So often, if you think about this example of farmers versus factory owners, the farmers wouldn't have the deep pockets of the factory owner. So it'd be very hard for them to pursue this through the courts. And as I mentioned, the polluters almost never shut down. And since the abatement technologies didn't exist, the best claimant could usually hope for was some kind of monetary compensation. All right, World War II comes about and we enter into the late industrial period. World War II sees the rise of things like pesticides. Lots of work gets put into developing new pesticides during the war because it was obvious to the US government that fighting in the South Pacific Seas, one of the biggest enemy of troops could be disease, especially mosquito-borne diseases. So things like DDT are developed and utilized during the war. And as soon as the war is over, these companies that are making these new chemicals understand that there's a tremendous market for these new chemicals, which is agricultural production. Another important thing that comes out of World War II are nuclear weapons and then nuclear power. So late industrial period, you just see a rise of incredible new amount of synthetic chemicals are introduced into commerce. These could be used not only in agriculture and manufacturing, but sometimes even in household goods, things like flame retardant furniture, plastic baby bottles made out of bisphenol A. So plastic is another important thing that becomes very common after World War II. Petrochemical industries really take off, so ag chemicals and plastics kind of born in the aftermath of World War II. I mentioned nuclear weapons. This introduces unprecedented types of pollutants when you have radioactive isotopes that can continue to be dangerous for tens of thousands of years. What you have, one term that you should know is persistent organic pollutants. These are different, along with radiation, from what we have in the early industrial period. And what's changed after World War II is that these persistent organic pollutants can continue to cause harm for long periods of time. And because of that, they can expand in terms of their geographical scale. So now these persistent organic pollutants can be transported through waterways, through the airways. They can bioaccumulate so that as you move up the food chain, they accumulate up the food chain. And this is what really distinguishes these two periods, is it's an issue of scale. Now, one part of the world can affect every part of the globe. Some terrible type of pollution created in one particular corner of the world now can travel out and affect the entire globe. Now, when these new technologies came out with, society initially loved them. They embraced them, thought that these were harbingers of a new era of plenty. And, you know, while there's a lot of truth to that, some of the faith was misplaced and a bit ridiculous. You can go back and see old commercials, old film footages, for example, showing children when you have a lice outbreak in school being let outside, stripped down, and then just being pumped with DDT as a way to treat the lice epidemic. Using radiation to increase the food supply, you know, people thought you would be able to make like bigger peanuts, and you know, there were even, again, you can see TV commercials from the 50s about how great these new technologies are, and they'll be able to even make our food supply more secure. People believed nuclear power was going to make electricity so cheap that someday meters would disappear. People would just pay a monthly fee, like at a buffet, for all the electricity you could consume. So in the 1950s, people are totally enamored with these new technologies. And it's not till the 1960s when writers like Rachel Carson and Barry Commoner begin to play an important role in highlighting the societal harm that is being caused by these new pollutants. Now, as a result of this information that starts to get out from people like Rachel Carson writing Silent Spring, public begins to get energized, and you develop this huge grassroots movement that starts in the 60s and carries over into the 70s. You could say the culmination of the power of, or the exercise of this grassroots movement is the first Earth Day in the US in March 21st, 1970. As a result of public pressure, subsequent presidents beginning in the 60s began to get behind measures to protect the environment. and Congress listens to the public and begins to pass a large body of statutory law to protect the environment and public health. The United States is really the first major industrial power to create an extensive body of statutory laws to protect the environment. Though I must add, some smaller countries like Canada and the Nordic countries were also quite active during this period. One of the highlights of this period is President Richard Nixon, a Republican, creates the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. The entire decade of the 70s is known as the decade of the environment. There have been very few policy successes at the federal level in the United States since 1970. We'll explore that in a little bit more detail. I could go through a laundry list of environmental statutes that passed in the 70s. I'll spare you that, just mention a few highlights: the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Toxic Substance Prevention Act. You go on and on. Almost everything that matters in the US from an environmental perspective occurred in the 70s, and the few improvements that have happened since then at the federal level are things that were built on what was established in the 70s. All right, I want to bring up an important issue: the US Constitution and the environment. First of all, we have the oldest written constitution in the world. It dates back to 1788. And frankly, in 1788, environmental concerns were not on the minds of society or the framers. At the time, the US was primarily an agricultural economy. Most people lived off farming, and pollution was not an issue. In the US, in newer written constitutions, often the environment is mentioned, and often some constitutions even mention that people have a right to live in a clean environment. Unfortunately, that's missing in our Constitution. And as of now, there's no amendment to the Constitution that's even being talked about along these regards. So because the Constitution has to be the basis of all new laws, Congress in the 1970s, when it was creating this vast body of statutory law, relied on the Interstate Commerce Clause, or as it's formally known, it's just the Commerce Clause. Problem with using the Commerce Clause is that it has left our environmental laws very open to court challenges. And a lot of these challenges have been successful, where opponents of environmental regulation have been able to use the courts to roll key provisions in many of our environmental laws, like the Clean Water Act, backward. I will give you an example. The Clean Water Act is supposed to protect navigable waters. Supposedly gives Congress the power to protect water quality because waters crosses state boundaries. It's important for navigation. The idea is that Congress has the right to protect it. So what happens though with a tertiary stream or a pothole or a ditch? Courts have struck down the power of Congress to regulate those and put them into the hands of the state. You might say that shouldn't matter, but it does matter. It's better to have one set of federal laws, because when you don't, then some states try to get an advantage by having either weaker environmental rules or not enforcing their rules. And we've actually seen this. When Rick Perry was governor of Texas, he went around the country boasting that Texas had some of the weakest environmental rules and encouraged companies from places like California, Missouri, New Jersey to consider relocating in Texas because of their weak environmental rules. This is what's known in the literature as the race to the bottom. And this is why it's better to have one set of federal rules rather than relying on a patchwork of state rules. All right. I want to also mention that the courts play a huge role in creating environmental policy in the US. So if you want to look at how environmental policy develops, it begins with legislative branch. Statutory laws passed, and then it becomes the job of the executive branch to interpret that. And Congress, because there are not a lot of scientists in Congress as a starter, always tended to pass things that were pretty vaguely worded. So, for example, the Clean Water Act mentions swimmable waters. What is a swimmable water? I've seen people swimming in water that I wouldn't dip my toe into. These are things that are very subjective. So what Congress is essentially doing is saying, here's kind of what we want. You have an idea of what we want. And then the appropriate executive agency, which is generally the Environmental Protection Agency, gets to determine what Congress really intended. And generally, the EPA pleases nobody. In the 1970s, after all these laws were passed, and as EPA would come out with their interpretation, and of course, this continued on into subsequent decades, environmental groups and industry groups would sue the Environmental Protection Agency. These court cases would then end up in the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, because that's where the federal government is. And essentially, you would have set of judges on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia making environmental law, having the final say in what Congress really intended. So a lesson to come out of this, and that opponents of environmental regulation quickly understood, is that if you want to control environmental law in the US, you need to have friendly judges on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. It's also important because this is where a lot of our Supreme Court justices tend to come from, this particular court. And as an addition to that, for the past few decades, certain interest groups in the US have been cultivating judges for high courts like the Appeals Circuit of the District of Columbia. And what they look for when they cultivate individuals, so looking for people that have a very negative view of government interference in the marketplace. Now, I want to mention some problems with going first. I mentioned the US was the first large country to move forward with an extensive body of statutory laws, and this usually comes with a cost. It's always expensive to go first because you make mistakes. Others can learn from your mistakes. In the 1970s, we tended to rely on what's called command and control regulation. This is where government tells industry there is a technological solution or an abatement solution, and you have to use it. And the problem with this is that it tends to be not very efficient from an economic perspective. More modern tools tend to be more market-based, tend to cost less, and often spark innovation that can even help improve the bottom line of affected industries. Another problem with early environmental laws were they were clumsy and often utilized rules that apply to all sizes of economic operations equally. One-size-fits-all rules can impose bearable costs on large companies, but these can be crippling to small companies, small farmers. So you don't want to impose the same rules on a small chicken farmer that raises his chickens outdoors as you would on a giant chicken farm that has tens of thousands of chickens in barns. But early environmental rules tended to be clumsy and hence helped to create a backlash of many people that felt government was unnecessarily harming their businesses. There was also a strong backlash that brewed in the US against environmental regulation. Industrial groups and influential conservatives like Adolf Coors, Andrew Mellon Scaife, and the Koch brothers were taken aback by the pace and success of environmental lawmaking in the 1970s. And they started to Some of them thought even that free enterprise was at stake in the US, that these rules constituted an attack on capitalism. And they started to fight back using some of the following tools. Creation of front groups like the Global Climate Coalition or Northwesterners for More Fish. What these groups do is they create a name that sounds like, if you heard Northwesterners for More Fish, you'd think these are fishermen who want more salmon, but actually it's the aluminum industry that and the hydroelectric industry that doesn't want to see things change in favor of more fish. The Global Climate Coalition, you think it would be a group concerned with stopping climate change. Really, it was fossil fuel companies in the 1990s and some car companies tried to deny that climate change was occurring and use this vehicle to disseminate information. Another tool was contributing money to political campaigns and purging the Republican Party of what are called rhinos, Republican in name only. If you look at the 70s, a lot of Republicans supported environmental laws, and indeed, some Republican presidents were very pro-environment, at least relative to leaders today. But that starts to erode away as people like the Koch brothers start to go after Republicans who support environmental protection measures. They also started supporting and endowing ideological think tanks like the Cato Institute, the Heartland Institute, and the Heritage Foundation. These three groups and many others, for example, our climate denial groups, tend to work against any kind of policy to protect against climate change. You also have the creation of alternative centers of power within the Republican Party, like Americans for Prosperity. Americans for Prosperity is almost like a shadow group within the Republican Party that's been bankrolled by two of the Koch brothers, now just one of the Koch brothers. And if you run afoul of them, they will use Americans for Prosperity to recruit and bankroll a candidate to run against you in the Republican primary. Pushing for the appointment of judges who are ideologically predisposed to be against government regulations is another tool that has been used. So, decade of the environment ends in 1980. Few things since then. The environmental movement is unable to adapt a suitable strategy for the altered political landscape, and it loses the power it enjoyed in the previous decades. The environmental movement, we'll talk more about that in a subsequent lecture, basically loses most of the power it once enjoyed and has not come close to reclaiming that power. There have been very few pieces of environmental legislation passed since 1980, and most of the things that have been passed build on existing rules and existing laws that were passed in the 70s. So amendments to the Clean Air Act under George Bush in 1990 were possible because the Clean Air Act already existed. Same thing with the Clean Power Plan that Obama passed. Again, he used the only power that he had, which was that in the 1970s, Congress had given the executive branch the power to protect air quality in the US. So Obama had the EPA declare carbon dioxide a pollutant. It survived various court challenges and even went to the Supreme Court, where it survived a 5-4 decision. And that became the foundation of the Clean Power Plan. In 1980, at the beginning of this decade, the US was seen as the global example, along with Canada and the Nordic countries, of what a country could do to protect its environment and public health. Today, the US has fallen way behind the efforts of most other high-income countries, and we'll explore that in discussion tomorrow. All right, I want to move on to the last part of this lecture, which is global environmental politics. Right. One of the first things I would want to do is put out a term which is called an international regime. An international regime is an agreement, or often a series of agreements around a certain goal that nation states agree to, and then they have to hold economic actors within their borders responsible to live up to those agreements. These are all, like everything at the international level, they're voluntary. There are no teeth attached to them. The UN can't force people in the US to do something, as is often argued. These are entirely voluntary in nature. The bad news is there have been many attempts at global cooperation, but few successes. A few outliers, successful outliers, include the regime against whale hunting and the regime against ozone depleting chemicals or substances. Most regimes are ineffective and are more like the regime on wetlands depletion, which is called the Ramsar Convention or the Biodiversity Convention. The intent is great, but the results are extremely disappointing. Most agreements, the reason why it's so hard to get agreements is, well, there are many reasons behind it. One is that agreements can involve winners and losers. Some countries benefit while others have to pay the cost in terms of jobs and economic production. An example, in the 1980s, acid rain was a big problem in many parts of the world. In Europe, it's especially an important issue. If you look at countries like Sweden and Norway, their lakes were dying because of acidification. The source of that sulfur dioxin was coal burning in England. Of course, Norway and Sweden wanted Great Britain to stop burning so much coal. But what did Great Britain at the time have to gain from that? Coal was the cheapest form of electricity. They had built up a lot of infrastructure around coal. If they were to burn less coal, that would hurt their economy. And yes, it would benefit Sweden and Norway, but that's requiring a lot of altruism. So that's a big problem. Another big problem is the process operates by consensus, not by majority rule. If you've ever been involved in an organization where you have to come to some sort of consensus, you know it can be painful. Can have one or two individuals in a group that just make it impossible to achieve any agreement. At the international level, this is especially true when the state that's trying to stop an agreement is an important, a large, powerful state. So on a topic like climate change, it's important for countries like China, India, and the United States to be on board. If Togo doesn't want to participate, that's not a big deal. But if one of those three large countries or the European Union doesn't want to participate, that's a big problem. In the literature, these are referred to when you have a state that's opposing something. That state is referred to as a veto or dragger state. And often, when either you've had successful or unsuccessful agreements, global community has had to overcome presence of one or more veto states. Lately, that's been the United States. During the past 3 decades, with the exception of the Paris Accord, the United States has always played the role of the veto state. So, now, what can you do what can the global community do when it's faced with an important veto state? Fortunately, it only has 2 options. It can work around that veto state, but there are problems with that. Without the veto state involved, first, it might be harder to meet your scientific determined goal, since that country's not participating, but also it makes it harder, especially if an economic sacrifice is involved, harder for the leaders of other countries to sell an agreement to their populations if they see that they're paying a price and somebody else isn't paying that price. So that we've seen that happen with Kyoto, where the rest of the world try to work around the US. Kyoto was the first major attempt by the global community to do something about climate change. That attempt went on for a decade and a half before collapsing. And the US acting like a veto state was clearly one of the things that doomed the Kyoto process. The other option that the global community has is to just weaken the agreement down to the level that the veto state will agree to get involved. And this has its cons also. First of all, if you weaken it so much, it might be meaningless. But if you also weaken it thinking that you're going to get a veto state to jump on, the veto state might not only not jump on, but might continue to sabotage the agreement to further weaken and gut it. So that's one problem. The other big problem is the so-called North-South divide. This is what's known as the divide between high-income and low-income countries. And that's been there from sort of the get-go. In 1972, the UN organized the first conference on environment and development, and low-income countries were furious. Most threatened to boycott, and in the end, most didn't send heads of state. And the one head of state that did show up, Indira Gandhi, basically came to lecture rich countries, claiming that they had caused most of the pollution and they should provide the solution, and that low-income countries shouldn't have their path to economic development burdened by unnecessary environmental agreements. So this has been a problem that's been with us that sometimes is genuine. Sometimes, interestingly, US has kind of turned it around where in the past it was often agreed that lower income states would have lesser responsibilities. When it came to climate change for the past few decades, the US often argued it shouldn't do anything because China and India weren't being held responsible to the same level. Then with the Paris Accord, when China and India were on board, we see now the US is backing off from the Paris Accord. All right, I quickly want to go over one successful case of an international regime, and that's the regime on ozone depleting substances. It begins with the Vienna Convention in 1981. Actually, it begins before that. It begins with the science that's being done in the 1970s, where the world becomes aware that chemicals used in things like styrofoam, coolants that used in air conditioners, refrigerators, these are escaping and destroying the stratospheric ozone. And again, there you have ground level ozone caused by pollution, like that's bad. Stratospheric ozone is good because it protects us from UV rays. And if you damage the stratospheric ozone, that can harm all living creatures on Earth, or at least most, by exposing plants and animals to damaging ultraviolet rays. So during the 70s, too, not only is the science becoming clearer and clearer, and you start to see evidence of a thinning ozone layer and even a hole opening up over Antarctica, but US actually is one of the countries that begins to take the lead on this. Back in the 70s, the companies that had an edge in terms of exporting a lot of these chemicals were not American. They were European. In particular, Japan also had some strong presence in this area. So big American chemical companies had actually developed alternatives. So companies like DuPont were happy with this because they thought they could take away some of the export market from European companies. So the US at this point in time is not a veto state at all. We're actually leading the charge. along again with the usual suspects, Canada and the Nordic countries. Interestingly, at this point in time, you have the Soviet Union, Japan, and the European Union resisting. Finally, in 1981, you have the Vienna Convention where the countries agree to discuss actions, but even at this point, they refuse to even identify what some of the guilty chemicals could be. So you have 4 years, and you get the next step is the Montreal Protocol. It's adopted in 1987. It enters into force in 1989. And by August 2008, most countries in the world have ratified it. Now, parties to the protocol continue to meet annually to assess their progress in protecting the stratospheric ozone. These meetings are called meetings of the parties, or MOPs, and each MOP has a number, just like Convention of the Parties, familiar with that around climate change, like COP21, COP22. Here you have MOP 1, MOP 4, and at each of these MOPs, at least for almost 20 years, I should say 15 years, the world kept getting together and agree on stricter measures so that we could meet our scientifically based objectives. I won't go through all of these, but here are some of the most important of these MOPs. You can see that all the way up until, actually there's some that come after 1999. Things are being tweaked and made, and more chemicals are being brought under. So for example, the Montreal Protocol regulated chlorofluorocarbons, and some companies then found an end around, which are hydrocarbon fluorocarbons. They're not as destructive as plain CFCs, but they're also destructive, and they weren't regulated under the first Montreal Protocol, so you needed a subsequent agreement to also regulate HCFCs. All right, this is the end of our lecture, and I'll close with some questions for discussion during next class. Please consider these before class and come prepared to discuss them. Thank you very much.